the types of investigations under the comparative, the comparative investigations. So when you think comparative, it should be pretty obvious like what it is we're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put a text box here. I'm going to go ahead and put a text box here, and I'm going to lower the font. All right. So when we are doing comparative investigation, we are looking at similarities and differences. So that's literally what a comparative investigation is. It is, so if we're getting the definition, it's going to be a investigation in which we look at the similarities and differences. Okay, and that's usually going to happen under different conditions. So you can kind of abbreviate there. Okay, look at the similarities and differences under different conditions. So that's kind of like the way that we do that. Okay. All right. Next, we are going to look at our key terms. Okay, key terms. So key terms. We want to look at, of course, similarities and differences. So anytime somebody says, "Oh, I wonder how this is different," or "how this is different," you're looking at comparative investigation. So these are our key terms. All right. If you see things like different locations, times of year, different times. Okay, these are all going to be things that should have a warning bell for you. Okay, this is a comparative investigation. Okay. Of course, this is a really, really big one. I'm going to even bold this. Okay. Compare and AND or ampersand contrast. Compare and contrast. All right. There's really not much more to it than that. Okay. So that is our comparative investigation. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and mash up the last part of this here. So now we're going to look at the experimental. Okay, we're going to look at the experimental. Okay. So experimental investigations. Experimental investigations. This one has quite a bit of material, so let's go ahead and try to cut it down as much as we can. All right. Experimental investigation. All right. Experimental investigation is an experiment in which you're doing stuff like labs. Okay, this is in the classroom, lab, through burn plate, balance and scale, and then you're making graphs and stuff like that. But it is essentially when you are, so this is their definition here, manipulating, you're coming up with a conclusion through manipulating and controlling variables. Remember, we talked about this when we did the Nature of Science worksheet the other day. All right, so parts of an experimental investigation, so the parts of the investigation are going to be the problem, the hypothesis, and the conclusion. Okay, so when we identify a problem, it is the question being asked. Okay. The hypothesis is going to be an educated guess of what will happen. And of course, the conclusion is describing what happened. Describing what happened in the experiment. Okay? So that's the kind of the gist of the experimental investigation here. So I'm going to put this over here. If you need to look at this in a bigger size again, you can always go back. Okay? So don't feel like you're oh no, it's too small now. Okay, you can always go back. All right, let's see. All right, so let's look around some more. Now let's talk a little bit about variables. Okay, variables. When we're manipulating variables, we said we were going to manipulate variables up here. All right, manipulating variables. So there are different types of variables that we're going to talk about. Okay, let's talk about different types of variables. Okay. You have the independent variables. Okay, so different types of variables. You have independent variables. So variables that the scientist changes, right? The ones that don't change on their own unless you change them. Then you have the dependent variables. ones that change when the independent variables change. So the dependent variables change as a result of the independent variables. And then, of course, you have the controlled or constant variables. These are the ones that the scientist changes, okay? Okay, these are kept constant by the scientist. And the controlled variables, they help allow, this is very important, for a fair test. Okay, they allow for a fair test. Okay, now, very, very important, our conclusion, so let's go back to the word conclusion. Our conclusion must support the hypothesis. Okay, if it doesn't support the hypothesis, then we need to go back and change our hypothesis and think and reevaluate what it was doing. Okay, if it does support the hypothesis, we accept the hypothesis. If it does not, we reject the hypothesis. This is the entire. So if yes, accept. If no, reject. This is the entire basis of scientific thought right here. We don't hold on to ideas just because we like them, right? If the data says that it doesn't work, we have to throw it out and kind of redesign our experiment and see if there was a problem in our understanding. Okay, so this is really, really, really important. Okay. Okay, so let's think about some key terms for that one. Some key terms. What are some key terms that we have? We talked about, well, pretty much all of these are key terms that we looked at, but let's go through and highlight the ones that I think are going to be the most important. Okay, so let's look at the beginning, our key terms here. We're going to go ahead and highlight some of these guys here. Let's highlight. Okay, we'll highlight the key terms. All right, so manipulation, variables, those are really, really, really important. So problem, hypothesis, conclusion. And let's move all this stuff out the way. Let's move this over here. Okay. Now under variables, we're going to highlight this here. Independent variable, dependent, control. And I think that should be pretty good. That should be pretty good. All right, so these are the things we're going to look for. All right.